Welcome to the third of our three panels on the subject of religious freedom, religious extremism, and the lessons of the Arab Spring. Now, what I thought I would do, I'm Tom Farr, Director of the Religious Freedom Project, and I'll introduce our panelists in just a minute, but I thought I would begin by just picking out a few of the themes that we've heard this morning, some of which we may pick up on in our discussion. As I mentioned at the beginning of this conference, this is a conversation, in a sense, a continuous conversation, in this case about the Arab Spring, but we have had and will have conferences on other countries, including China, Russia, India, and the United States. I mentioned a conference next week on religious freedom in the United States, and I hope you'll all come to that. I want to sketch out just a few themes. I suspect each of you would have chosen different ones, perhaps some of the ones that I've chosen, but that struck me as interesting. Some of them came from the audience questions. I'll lay them out very briefly here. The first is the proposition that we heard in our first panel that the content of particular religions does not have a significant impact on violent religious extremism, or at least the data seem to show that. And I assume that would continue into what we're calling Islamist extremism. We had some questions about that. I think that's an interesting proposition, one that is supported by data, but one that, as one of our questioners said, seems a little bit counterintuitive. I suspect we'll return to that. And the notion that the main causes of religious extremism are sort of exogenous to the religions themselves, the teachings, the doctrines, and so forth, and that structures and institutions have more an effect on the rise of extremism than do religious doctrines. Grievances have a great deal to do with this. We heard from Mohammed on that particular subject. A lot more came out of that first panel. I don't mean to slight it. Some incredible statistical work done by the talented people on that panel, and I invite you to look at their websites and the excellent works that they talked about. In this extraordinary policy conversation that we just had, for some of the three of the most important and consequential, and I think you saw talented policymakers that the United States has had in the past two administrations, a number of interesting things were said, some of it at 10,000 feet policy. It was a lot of fun to listen to that. I want to pull out a couple of religious freedom things that came out of that conversation. Steve Hadley said, and I think he's right, if you try to impose religious freedom in full on Middle Eastern nations, you're going to empower religious extremists because it won't work. So what we need, he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, is religious tolerance as a kind of halfway house toward religious freedom, by which he meant something short of full participation of all religious groups on a basis of equality within a society, but working toward that end. So baby steps, if you will, a halfway house toward religious freedom. Dennis Ross made toward the end of his remarks the point that every country, including every Muslim majority country, is different when it comes to religion and certainly to religious freedom and its needs. So when we think about the so-called Muslim world, which is a term that isn't used too much anymore, and I think properly so, we need to think in terms, at least, of Muslim worlds or different countries in which Islam is reflected and expressed in different ways. I think that was an important point. Elliot Abrams made the point that religious freedom, like democracy, needs what he called a limiting principle to prevent majoritarian tyranny. And I think that's very important because here he is inviting us to talk about the limits to democracy and the limits to religious freedom. Religious freedom doesn't mean everything goes. Like every other freedom in civil and political society, there are limits to this particular freedom, and I think that's an important part of the conversation. Perhaps we'll get into it a bit here. All of them ended up agreeing that the book of democracy in Egypt is now being written, and we should contribute. I think, as I forget, it was Dennis perhaps that said it, or maybe Steve Hadley, we should contribute as we can and as we are invited to do so. I kind of like that phrase. In helping them succeed in gaining democracy and first religious tolerance and then perhaps religious freedom. And then finally, I have to point out that Elliot Abrams said he preferred the American model to the French model, although Steve Hadley said that he thinks some of the American people are becoming French. I was a little disturbed to hear that, but with that, let me turn now to this extraordinary panel of experts and introduce them to you. First, let me tell you what we've asked them to reflect on, and you'll find a remarkable similarity to the other themes of this conference. And this isn't everything we asked them to do, but this is give you a feel for the kinds of things we've asked them to give some thought to. Whether a free and fair democratic system that makes room for all religious actors, including Islamists, is best for Egypt and the other Arab Spring countries in the long run. Second, whether a regime of robust religious freedom, which we posit, although they may not, is an essential component of religious democracy, whether robust religious freedom is likely to moderate the illiberal radicalism of some of these religious actors, or is it, to the contrary, more likely to unleash illiberal radicalism? And then finally, and here we move back into the area that we just discussed a bit in our keynote conversation, how can U.S. foreign policy, including our policy of advancing religious freedom, best foster both robust democracy and religious freedom in Egypt, or if you like, religious tolerance, as well as the other countries affected by the Arab Spring? So let me now introduce our panelists in the order in which they're going to speak. And we'll each talk 10, 12 minutes. We'll have a little conversation among ourselves, and then as always, we want to get our audience involved. First, Samer Shahata is an assistant professor in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. He teaches courses on Islamist politics, comparative, note that, Islamist politics, comparative and Middle East politics and political economy, U.S. policy toward the Middle East, Egyptian politics and society, and culture and politics in the Arab world. He has served as acting director of the Master of Arts in Arab Studies program, and his writings have appeared in many journals and newspapers, including the International Journal of Middle East Studies, Middle East Policy, the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. I'm glad that you have published here at Georgetown. Slate, Salon, Al-Hayat, and Al-Ahram Weekly, a nice mixture there. I'll say that I first saw Samer myself, or met him once before, but I saw him recently on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer and was very impressed with what he had to say and look forward to hearing from him. Next will be Jillian Schwedler, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. We've already heard from Jillian earlier in an extraordinarily good question, which led to, I thought, some reflective and interesting answers. Her academic interests include, listen to this now, political culture, protest and policing in Jordan, neoliberalism, identity politics, and this is my favorite, contentious politics. Where is there politics that is not good? That's me. Here. And state repression. Professor Schwedler has received awards and fellowships from the Social Science Research Council, the Fulbright Foundation, the Council of American Overseas Research Centers, and the American Institute for Yemeni Studies. You heard a question about Yemen. She's conducted wide-ranging field research in Egypt, Jordan, and Yemen, and has traveled extensively throughout the region. And finally, last but not at all least, Sam Tadros, who's a research fellow at the Hudson Institute. He was a senior partner at the Egyptian Union of Liberal Youth, an organization that aims to spread the idea of classical liberalism in Egypt. Before joining the Hudson Institute, Tadros worked on the subject of the Muslim Brotherhood at the American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation on the subject of religious freedom in Europe. He's written for many journals, newspapers, and blogs, including the Wall Street Journal, the American Thinker, especially about the subject of liberalization in Egypt. And I just have to add that this is the first panel that I've ever moderated in which a former student of mine participated, and that's Sam Tadros. So, glad to have all of you here. Professor Shahata, would you lead us off?
Thank you very much. I should preface my remarks by saying that unlike Jillian and Samuel and Muhammad Hafiz in the morning and some of the other distinguished panelists, I don't really work on questions of moderation and extremism. In fact, I have my students read your work, or religious freedoms or religious minorities. But I have done quite a bit of work over the last few years on Egyptian politics and quite specifically the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's in that frame that I kind of will approach the questions that I've been asked to address. And as you mentioned, there were 3 questions, and I'll try to briefly address them as much as I can in order. And the first, of course, and the easiest to answer was, whether a fully inclusive, free and fair democratic system that makes room for all voices, including Islamist voices, is best for Egypt and other Arab Spring countries in the long run. And I think, obviously, the answer to this question is clear, at least for me, and that is yes. And that, in fact, that any implication that limiting the participation of Islamist groups that seek to participate in formal politics in the political process by peaceful means, even those who hold views which we might consider illiberal, and even in some cases, as some of the Salafi groups' views are, I think, detestable, any attempt to move in that direction is anti-democratic. And for that reason alone, I think the question needs to be addressed in the affirmative. Yes, a fully inclusive, free and fair democratic system makes the best sense. And in fact, anything other than that really represents a step backwards, a failed logic of the past, a logic in which we supported Mubarak because we thought the alternative was worse. Or as Mr. Sarkozy said in France, that it's better to have Bouteflika than an Algerian Taliban, or better to have Mubarak than the Muslim Brotherhood. And I reject that not only on the basis of religious freedom issues, but on the basis of my commitment to democracy. The second question has to do with, and I think my how I received it was slightly different than how you presented it a moment ago, and your question was harder to answer, so I'm going to tell you the question that I understood was, would a regime of liberal democracy, including adherence to the principles of religious freedom, moderate or unleash the illiberal radicalism of some of these voices? And the difference in emphasis is the emphasis on liberal democracy as opposed to a regime that highlighted religious freedoms. That's the slight variation. And my answer is, and I think this is somewhat similar to some of the excellent discussion that was in panel 1 this morning, was, well, I don't know. But I would hope, and this is where I defer to both Gillian and Mohammed, I would hope that inclusion in the political system, that political inclusion would force some groups, if not to moderate, to at least behave like political parties, interested in gaining votes, interested in winning seats, interested in influencing policy, and maybe less like only ideologically committed organizations that aren't necessarily interested in doing these things. Because if they are interested in participating in the political process, gaining seats, winning votes, and influencing policy, then you would think that they would present their message according to the median voter theory, present their message in a way that would attract the largest number of voters, and therefore it would be transformative in that sense. In addition to attempting to build coalitions involving compromise and negotiation with other political forces, including ones which they disagree with. And that also would have a positive or salutary effect. And I think we've seen that, actually, with regard to the Muslim Brotherhood from the 1980s, forging alliances on specific issues, and in other cases as well, not only in Egypt, but in other places. And we've also surprisingly seen that in a very beginning sense with some of the Salafi parties in Egypt. Moreover, and this is something that Dennis Ross and Stephen Hadley and Elliot Abrams, and I'm surprised that I agree with so much of what some of what they've said, because my politics is a little different than theirs. Moreover, we would think that in elections and in participation in elections, that the voting public or electorate would make future decisions based on performance, based on whether these groups have delivered jobs, whether they've established better educational systems, health care that wasn't deteriorating, whether they've generated economic progress, as opposed to simply the idea that Islam huwa al-hal, or the Sharia is the answer, Islam is the solution, and so on. Okay, the other thing that is related to that question, I think, is, you know, it's not directly implied, but I do want to just highlight it a little bit, is that there does seem to be an assumption, and I have a little bit of difficulty with this, that the type of government in a place like Egypt or Tunisia or elsewhere should somehow look very much like the government that we have here in the United States. And I think that's a false assumption. I think that we should expect forms of politics and political discourse to look quite different. The key thing, however, is whether these political systems, constitutions, institutions are robust enough to guarantee rights, including rights of religious freedom, not whether the system in the end is our model of the ostensible separation of church and state, and so on. The third question that was posed, and I will also take some liberty to move after I initially addressed it in a different direction, was how can the U.S. best foster both robust democracy and inclusive religious freedom in Egypt and other countries affected by the Arab Spring? And I hope you're looking at the minutes, because I'm certainly not in terms of how much time I'm taking. I think some of the key things to understand about this question is that the legacy, unfortunately, the legacy of U.S. involvement in Egypt and other states in the region, supporting of the Mubarak regime for decades, is not a very good one. And it makes it extremely difficult for the U.S. to be seen as credibly interested in promoting democracy, freedom and human rights, even religious freedoms in Egypt and states in the future. When most Egyptians, I think, look at the United States, they see decades of support for the Mubarak regime, politically, militarily, and economically. They see little, in fact, sustained criticism in the past, with consequences of systematic human rights abuses, consistent electoral violations, or repression. Interestingly enough, the U.S. did focus sometimes on some liberal activists when they were the victims of the regime's wrath, like Saad ad-Din Ibrahim or Ayman Noor, who I used to call Condi Rice's favorite Egyptian, because there were 20,000 or 15,000 Egyptian political prisoners in jail at different times in the Mubarak regime, but she seemed to only focus on Ayman Noor. And what that means is that other people who were in prison, including members of the Muslim Brotherhood, like Khayrat al-Shatir, for example, who now is quite prominent, and people are talking about him as being a potential prime minister, the deputy guide, who was unfairly tried in an Egyptian military court and sentenced to 5 years in prison and served many of them and so on. No mention was made by U.S. officials of that injustice and so on. And it doesn't only end on January 25th with the beginning of the revolution. You might remember that on January 25th, the first day of the revolution in quotation marks, Secretary Clinton said that the Egyptian government was stable and that it was looking for ways, and I'm quoting, to respond to the legitimate needs and interests of the Egyptian people, unquote. And the following day, she called on all parties, meaning the protesters and the regimes, to exercise restraint, setting up, unquote, setting up some kind of a moral equivalency between the protesters and the regime's repressive apparatus. The following day, on the 27th, Vice President Biden said that Mr. Mubarak was not a dictator, and so on. And in fact, if we want to go even deeper with this, we can speculate that the message that Ambassador Frank Wisner gave to Mr. Mubarak on his visit there on February 5th was not the message that we were hearing the American administration was presenting, and that is immediate change now, but in fact the message that he told reporters afterwards, which is in order for an orderly transition, quote unquote, to take place, Mr. Mubarak needs to stay in power to oversee that transition until September, probably so that an outcome like we saw in the recent elections doesn't transpire. So this point, the point here is there's really a dilemma for the United States right now, right, as witnessed by the recent NGO controversy and so on. There also has to be a recognition that the U.S. has decreased influence, not only in Egypt, but across the region. That in authoritarian states, right, like Mr. Mubarak's and Mr. Ben Ali's and King Abdullah's and so on, which don't allow citizens to have significant voice in politics and policy, and which are allied with the United States and heavily dependent on U.S. foreign political and diplomatic support, that the U.S. has much greater influence in those kinds of polities than in polities which have popular sovereignty and in which governments are supposedly based on the will of the people. And there's one other thing, and this gets to the religious freedom issue directly, and then I'll stop even though I could go for much longer. The idea, and this is more of a question really, it does seem to me, possibly because the way the discourse of religious freedom by the United States was seen and received in Egypt in the past and so on, as a kind of colonial discourse, as a kind of a discourse that was insincere and that championed one group, Egyptian Christians primarily, and so on, at the expense of everyone else. And I'll be the first person to say that Egyptian Christians have and continue, and maybe increasingly, suffered discrimination and deteriorated status post-Egypt revolution. But nevertheless, because that discourse was viewed as such, it generated a tremendous backlash among Egypt. And in fact, it might even be counterproductive, thinking about it now, to continue to pursue a discourse that focuses explicitly on religious freedom as opposed to a more general discourse focused on democracy, equal citizenship rights, including within that, of course, religious freedom. I'll stop there. I was hoping or planning to say a lot more about Islamists in Egypt, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis, but maybe in the question and answer period I'll have an opportunity to do that. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, a lot of what I wanted to say was also actually echoed this morning, so I'm going to try to move quickly past some of the things that were mentioned, but to reiterate where I agree and maybe some points where there's a little bit of disagreement, or at least some questions. So I see the theme of the conference as these two related theses, that inclusion will lead to moderation and exclusion will lead to radicalism. And connected with that is this question of religious freedom, and will religious freedom in general produce a kind of moderation? So I want to separate those two and take those in turn. On the first, I think it's really important to separate the arguments, the hypotheses, I'd say, the propositions, that repression leads to extremism and inclusion leads to moderation. There's not a simple, a slide along a continuum where it's like reduced repression is going to automatically lead to moderation and then it could go back again. There's different mechanisms that could be work in each case, and I'm going to talk about some of these briefly. But just to give a simple example, you could easily have a system become much more inclusive, have a large number of parties move to a more moderate direction, and have some of those that are still left extremists escalate what they're doing, escalate their extremism. And so overall, you'd still maybe even see more violence. And I think actually the literature, which Professor Berner talked about this morning, the literature on repression leads us to expect this. It's a curvilinear relationship. When you have the extreme repression is loosened slightly, you may have some pull, but you're going to also see an explosion of overall violence. And so I think we need to sort of separate these two propositions. And so the one that gets, that has to do with the sort of religious groups is less about the repression producing extremism, which I think the logic of that is fairly clear. It doesn't always do that, but severe repression leads groups to go underground, and when they don't have a whole lot else they can do, there aren't a whole lot of options, it can lead groups that otherwise might be strange bedfellows to work together. This, after all, is the basic logic of why we end up with revolutions, right? You have groups with radically different images of what the society should be, but they all cohere on the people want the end of the regime. They cohere on some simple point. And that happens because all the other differences get put aside. So the logic of an inclusive system is to take away that unifying point of overthrowing a regime or overthrowing a system entirely. And so as you lead to a more inclusive system, people then can move more to what their own individual groups can move to what their more individual agendas might be. And you'll see, for example, Islamist groups that might have a little bit of affinity in a repressive system, those differences will start to pull apart, is the hypothesis you would expect to see. And I think empirically, there's actually evidence to expect that in a number of cases in the region, but as was mentioned also this morning, this isn't necessarily a question only of Islamist politics. This is something you've seen in a number of cases historically. And I'll return to that in a second. But I do want to mention one of my big points I want to emphasize here is in a more inclusive system, you may not actually see extremists becoming moderate. What you might actually be seeing, and what I think is more often what you see, is moderates don't have a logic to ally with extremists anymore. And so the moderates will pull away and their voices will become more prominent and their agendas will become more prominent. But that doesn't mean you're seeing them pull away, that they were the ones that were extreme being pulled to the center. And I think that's an important point. That doesn't mean extremists might not necessarily also moderate. But very often, that is what you're seeing. So my book, Faith and Moderation, examines Islamists in Jordan, Yemen, as they enter the political system. And a point that I repeat repeatedly in the book is neither one of these Islamist groups had sought to overthrow the regime, had ever perpetrated violence on the regime. In fact, in both cases, they had been allied with the regime, but still also as opposition, but sort of friendly opposition at times. And so to hold those as cases of successful moderation misses the point that they were never the extremists in the first place. But what happens in a more inclusive system is you eliminate the logic for moderates to have to go ally with extremists. So that's the first point, what I think is unpacked in this sort of inclusion-exclusion question, is the logic of alliances among these elites, or different actors. And elites not in the sense of social and economic elites, but the elites in the sense of the politically organized leaders of groups, movements. So the Salafi and the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, et cetera. I think a more inclusive system changes the logic, whether it's tactical or strategic, but it changes the logic of those interactions. The second side to it, which I think is equally important, has to do with the constituencies for those groups. And so in a more repressive system, when groups that are organizing don't have a whole lot of options, and they might work together, or they might just all be underground separately, very often the broader population will look for the group that is making the most extreme statements against the regime, like let's get the regime out, let's overthrow this system. And so they might have a larger support base. Again, this is a proposition that I will then come back to in a second. So the logic would be that not only does an inclusive system take away the logic for moderates to have to ally with extremists against the repressive system, it also takes away, introduces more possibilities for the general public at large. So a public that wants to see something other than the incumbent regime now has a whole range of things to choose from. If you want to see a more religiously inspired, morally religiously inspired regime, you don't only have one pole to go to. You, in fact, have a whole range of different groups to choose from. And here we see, historically, very significant differences between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi. And I hope Professor Shahatta says more about this in the question and answer, because it's really very instructive. And so I think there's these twin logics, the logics of alliances among the elites, and also this constituency support base, where a more inclusive system takes away the support base for extremism. It will not eliminate them entirely. Even the best functioning democracies we have, we don't entirely eliminate extremists, but you isolate them. They're fringe factors. They're seen as, nutcases, if you will. But they're there. And so if the hope is to eliminate extremism through an inclusive system entirely, that's simply not going to happen. The second side of what I want to talk about has to do with this question of religion and religious freedoms. And I completely agree. I think religious freedoms for me need to be front and center, and I would even broaden that to say not just religious freedoms, but freedom of beliefs, because you want to include in that the freedom not to believe in religion, of course. So the freedom of beliefs needs to be front and center for me in any kind of inclusive system, whether it's a democracy or a liberal democracy or a representative democracy or some other kind of system. It's absolutely essential to me that that be front and center. I would wish for more, personally, more for a French system just to say, so what Americans think. As an American, I'd just like to throw out.
So you're one of the Americans that's becoming French.
Well, I understood his point to say that Americans were, that it was the administrators that were pulling towards the French system, but Americans were pulling maybe even towards a more religious system.
Ah, okay.
So maybe I'm with the
So it's our
Atlantic
elites are becoming French.
Or am I like Samer, aligning with the administration in some ways that I need to deeply reflect upon? So I think for me, and this again echoes points that came up this morning, for me, what's important about religion is not that it's confessional per se. And so you do want to have freedom of confessionalism, your freedom to believe whatever you like and to structure your moral world around whatever framework works for you. But it's not religion per se. For me, I would think of it more as religion of confessional systems as a kind of a worldview. And so a worldview, it's sort of the ethical, moral understanding of what the world is, how it functions, and how it should function. What would be a better system? And religions, of course, are front and center in the spectrum of worldviews, but there are other worldviews that present other moral systems. The virtue of a inclusive system is it allows you to sort of find symmetry in certain components of that moral vision without having to be the same. And so that the logic of trying to give the moderate voices more platform and more opportunities to express themselves is to allow more places to find those symmetries. To isolate the worldviews, the religious worldviews and the secular worldviews that find no room for any alternative at all. It's my view and anything else is simply unacceptable. And so a more inclusive system creates the space where those kind of symmetries can happen. And in that sense, different religions and secular groups will find all kinds of common ground about moral issues. And I think that's a significant virtue of inclusive political systems. And I'm just jumping ahead. So in some ways, I think the confessionalism per se is almost epiphenomenal to the other sort of effects of an inclusive and exclusive system. It isn't necessarily about religion or about a belief system, but it's about a system that allows space for different sets of beliefs, different worldviews, some of which may be religious, some of which may not be. But I think it's that kind of space that I think inclusive systems can foster that will then reduce extremism by allowing for the creation of space where that symmetry can be explored, where groups can talk to each other and have open debates and have discussions, et cetera. And I found this in Jordan and Yemen, and in the case of Jordan, I found much more moderation with the Islamist Party, in part because Islamists found a lot of common ground with secularists, communists, and liberals on a number of issues. Now, there are often political issues, so objection to the electoral system was the first one in the summer of 1993. For the very first time, all of these groups, Islamists and communists and secularists, had a joint press conference. And it was a spectacle. It was spectacular because it was a spectacle that they should all be sitting there together in agreement on this issue. Now, it's one finite issue, and that'll bring me to another point in a second. But I think an open system creates the spaces where we can say, I disagree with you, Samer, but let's agree on this and push this issue together. And that is a positive thing for tolerance, if we're going to talk about tolerance. It also brings up a point, though, that moderation or extremism, but let's take moderation, isn't a single position on a continuum. So a group does not become necessarily moderate in all aspects of everything it does. And very often what you find is an inclusive system leads to the logic of political moderation. It may have nothing to do with other kinds of issues. Famously with Islamists, very conservative positions remain on women, elaborate internal debates about justifications of the roles women can play, what candidates will be fielded, et cetera, criticism of certain foreign policy issues, notions of what's the best economic system, et cetera. But we should not mistake to say that moderation, to the extent we might find moderation in an inclusive system, we don't assume that a single actor will become uniformly more moderate across all issue dimensions. I think you need to unpack the different issue dimensions and say, on what issues is the group moderating, and on what issues have they not? And Janine Clark has done some really interesting work on Jordan in particular, that the issue of women's participation is a red line issue for the Islamic Action Front. It's an issue that they don't want to cooperate. Even where there's an agreement, they don't want to have joint press conferences on issues. They want to maintain that separate space. And so I think there's a lot really interesting to unpack here. Well, I'm way out of order, as usual. So The last point, so, U.S. foreign policy, I also had a very similar reaction, that there was a lot I found in agreement with the last panel, and that was, interesting to me, and I want to think more about that.
They're out of office now, so they
No, exactly, and they wouldn't make comments on anyone who was still in office, and that was my point of my question. I think, I think Sam laid this out, beautifully, but the U.S. has such a negative reputation in the region, and my point earlier about my question about Jordan and legitimacy is Jordanians tell me that if the Jordanian state told them that their children need to drink more milk, they would all go dump milk in the driveway. And the same thing with the United States. So sort of anything the U.S. is pushing is automatically going to be suspicious. Any group that the U.S. stands behind is automatically going to have a problem. So I think the way the U.S. can speak loudest is by being hands-off on the particular mechanics, but very supportive of processes in general. And by being supportive of processes in general, that means not channeling vast amounts of money to the SCAF and very little money to other kinds of things. So being receptive to say, what do you need? Do you need training in this? Do you need us to come in and help you learn how to be parliamentarians? But sort of a more open, what can we give you? What would you like from us? As opposed to, let us tell you now how to be good Democrats. Because I think that will inherently backfire, even if there's a lot of common ground there, which there is an extraordinary amount of common ground. And I'll end with one point that the sort of, I completely disagree with the idea that nobody predicted the Arab Spring. In fact, everyone predicted the Arab Spring over and over and over. The problem is we didn't pick the exact moment. But if you look through writings, there's a famous Cassandra article on Egypt, and it was 1997, I believe, said this cannot be sustained. And all of us who've been working in the region, we know of vast pockets of dissent, of people just desperate for that moment. We didn't predict the moment. So I'm not saying that we got it right. But there was, the idea that everybody saw these as equilibrium states and they were repressive and nothing was going to ever change, I don't think is quite fair either. I think it was somewhere in the middle. So.
Well, Sam, before you speak, I think what Dennis Ross said was that the Obama administration did a review in which most agreed it wasn't sustainable, right, but that it simply was not about to change. And it was the rapidity and the surprise of the change that took them, weeks after this thing was published.
Right.
This guy set himself on fire in much of the Middle East. So there's probably more agreement there than disagreement. Sam, which is unusual in this field. I'd like to point it out. Please.
First, thank you for inviting me here to speak. It's a great pleasure, especially as Professor Farr has indicated. I'm a former student of his, so anything I say that you disagree with, you know who to blame for. So, anyway, the two questions that, the two first questions that were posed to us that I will comment on, and then perhaps focus a bit on the situation in Egypt towards religious freedom at the moment and how it will progress. The first question, as Professor Shahata indicated, is very hard to answer in the negative. Who possibly can argue that a fully inclusive, free, fair, democratic system that makes room for everyone is good on the long run? The formation of the question takes into consideration, perhaps, all those criticisms that have been put forward towards the promotion of democracy under the Bush administration or in general. The inclusive, free, and fair takes into consideration this perhaps modern debasement of the concept of a free society to essentially mean a ballot box. Indicated, no, we're talking about something more than that. It highlights that this system will give room to others, to whether it is all voices, whether Islamic voices or religious minorities, indicating that no one will be sidelined in this process. It also signifies a recognition of a time frame. Perhaps problems will be there in the beginning, but we're talking about the long run. Sure, no one would disagree with such a statement. The second statement, however, is perhaps a bit more problematic. The statement says that whether, I got the same statement that Dr. Shahata received, whether a regime of liberal democracy, including adherence to principles of religious freedom, might serve to moderate or unleash the illiberal radicalism of some of these voices. Now, there is a couple of assumptions in this statement that deserve some consideration. The first of these assumptions Of course, the statement indicates some form of qualification. Some of the voices will either be moderated or will become more radical, and not all of them. But there is an underlying assumption that there is some form of relationship between religious freedom, or the lack thereof, and religious radicalization. That this form of relationship is one of negative correlation. The more you have of religious freedom, the less you have of radicalization. That assumption, however, needs to be tested with the reality of the situation. As Edmund Burke indicated in the opening pages of his reflections on the revolution in France, it is circumstances and not abstract principles that render any political or civil policy whether beneficial or toxic to human beings. So in that light, the question is whether there is a relationship in the past between the emergence of Islamism as a clear discourse and between the lack or the existence of religious freedom or liberal democracy. Looking at the past, looking at the beginnings, the formations of the Salafi movement in Egypt, for example, 1912 and 1926, the establishment of the first Salafi organizations in Egypt, the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, whether at that time the lack of religious freedom was important, whether it played a role in the formation of modern Islamism, and whether, thus by providing more religious freedom, we will get a better situation. We find in the writings of those founders of Islamism a lack of importance of that factor. True, they have many complaints regarding the West, colonialism, Western interference, there are many there. Perhaps Hassan al-Banna, when he views democracy, he views it rather in the negative and not as something that he would complain about as to one of the reasons why he would form his organization. So looking at the past might be something to consider about this statement. The second, however, assumption is also worth some consideration of ours. There is an acceptance in this statement of the claim by Islamism to be an authentic representation and interpretation of Islam. Now, that Islamism claims to be so is something that is obvious to anyone. That that claim is correct, or that we should consider it as true, is something perhaps that we need to think about a bit more. Certainly, Islamism is a modern phenomenon. Its roots might not be traced necessarily into Islamic jurisprudence. Perhaps the Salafis having much more an authentic claim to some forms of Islam than the Muslim Brotherhood. But in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, those roots are hardly there or hardly evident to point to. So why should we care about religious freedom then? Am I arguing that religious freedom is only a nice concept that, yes, we should promote because it's a good human value? Certainly not. There is a value in religious freedom in this debate, and perhaps it was referred to here. By religious freedom here, I refer to the ability of people to bring religion to the public square, of making religious-based arguments in that open public square. However, there is an interesting here word that is missing that is perhaps taken into as a granted fact in the United States, and that's diverse religious views. The reason why religious freedom would be extremely important in Egypt and in other countries in the region would be because of the ability of individuals to think differently, and then to collectively form an alternative to the basic assumptions. It is, if there is no religious freedom in Egypt, if Farag Fouda was not allowed to write and criticize the basic premises of Islamic history, then the Islamic State model will become the applicable model and the one that is the only applicable one or the only one presented to people. If Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid is not allowed to criticize or to offer a different interpretation of the Islamic tradition and hadith, then the existing interpretation, the one dominated by the Islamists, will be the only one offered to the Egyptian people. It is thus no surprise that being Muslim will be only defined by how the Islamists define a Muslim. For this reason, it is important to defend religious freedom and to work on bringing religious freedom as an integral part of building a liberal democracy in the region. Let me now move with this to the present and future and the situation of religious freedom in Egypt. Religious freedom in Egypt is hardly a happy story. There simply isn't that much of religious freedom in the country. Certainly it is not Saudi Arabia, it is not Iran. But the situation of religious freedom in Egypt has been shaped by the dynamic relationship, interrelationship between the religious establishment, the state, the Islamists, and the general public. Each of these has played a different factor or a different role in the lack of religious freedom in the country. But it is how they operate together that creates this vacuum of freedom for whether religious minorities, intellectuals, and others to think differently. That situation has perhaps worsened much more after the revolution. We've seen a dramatic increase in the number of attacks against the Copts, but more importantly than the fact that there is an increase of attacks is the fact of the shape of those attacks. Increasingly, we see that the general public has participated in those attacks, that your neighbors are angered by the fact that you are building a church, or that some Christian girl, some Muslim girl, has some affair with a guy from another religion. The participation of your general public, of your neighbors, is perhaps the most worrisome sign to the future of religious freedom in Egypt. Concerning the Islamists and their role, I would perhaps look at 2 points in that regard. First, if time allows, of course. The first is how the Muslim Brotherhood has written very clearly about their view of the Coptic church especially. The Muslim Brotherhood has always been accused of not having a program, of using slogans and not programs. Well, they've given us a 96-page program that anyone can read and see their views about it. They've given us a page and a half about the Coptic church specifically. That page and a half is extremely interesting to read. First, it says that it highlights an interest of the Muslim Brotherhood to take control of the Christian endowments from the church. The reason they provide in this page 64 of their program is that the religious endowments should serve all Egyptians regardless of religion. Nicely put, I would say. But more interesting is how they define the church role according to them. The church role is to take its place along with other state institutions in fighting the cultural invasion from the West. The church should cooperate with different state institutions and Egyptian civil society to correct current deviant paths. That statement reminds one of a model that has perhaps become less relevant in the world, that of a national church model. The repression that the churches have suffered under communism, the attempt by the ruling regime to control the official religious establishment and thus use it as a way to control the religious minority. That, I think, would be something interesting to watch in the future. And more profoundly in terms of the Muslim or the Islamic religious authorities and how the Muslim Brotherhood will deal with Al-Azhar as an interpreter or representative of Sunni Islamic authority. The second interesting thing to note or dynamic to note in the future will be this relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis. Whether the Muslim Brotherhood, used to the fact of being the guys on the right or the guys on the more extreme, how will they deal now with the fact of being challenged from the right? How will they deal with the question of their base, the possibility of losing their base to the more radical Salafis? So the dynamic relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis will not only tell us a lot about the future politics of Egypt, but it will also be extremely important in how the fate of religious minorities and religious freedom in general takes shape. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Sam. Well, you've all three of you have given us a great deal to reflect upon. I think what I'd like to do, given the amount of time left, is sort of try to ask an Uber question and start with Samar and go down the line again and get you to reflect on, use this question to accentuate the themes that you would like. I'm going to pick up on Sam Tadros's notion that religious freedom means more than private, if you like, confessionalism. I'm not sure this is the way Gillian was using it or not. But it means the right to bring your religion into the public square. Now that can mean a lot of things. It can mean politics, religion and politics, using your religious beliefs to make religious arguments for laws and policies, economic, other foreign policies as well as domestic policies. It can mean, dare I say it, proselytism, or trying to convince other people. I believe this came up very early today. Convince other people that your religious claims are true and they ought to accept those claims and join your club, but leave the club they're in, which is a big, big problem in the Muslim majority countries of the world, just as it was a huge problem in medieval Europe, or should I say in Europe 14 centuries into its existence as a Christian-dominated culture. So it's not a new problem, it's not an unknown problem. So religious freedom as meaning the right to enter the public square. Here's the question. Does Egypt really need this to succeed as a democracy? And by success, I mean last. I mean, you know, we don't get a collapse in a generation or even two, or, you know, the return of a Mubarak-like figure, or simply chaos. How important is this aspect of religious freedom to success? And mind you, this means not only freedom for Coptic Christians, it does mean that, to enter into the public square, to make Christian arguments within Egypt, which may sound a little bit far-fetched, but also, as Sam said, for Muslims to criticize the Muslim Brotherhood, or to criticize openly, without fear of recrimination, an understanding of Islam that they may consider to be simply false, without being accused of blasphemy or defamation of Islam. So, in short, this is not just about minorities. It's also about the majority community and disfavored members of the majority community. Samar.
Well, that's a very, very difficult question, and I don't know if I'll even begin to be able to address it in any way. But I think what I will agree with is that, you know, this idea of religious freedom isn't as simple as one might think. I mean, because as you have done, you've kind of separated different dimensions of it. And in fact, I have not even gone that far. What I have focused on, and what I think is quite crucial at this moment, and maybe that's because I'm living in this particular moment with regard to the difficulties that are going on in Egypt right now, are, and this might not exactly be religious freedom, but ideas of equality without regard to religion. It's not really religious freedom, but I think is quite crucial at this particular moment, and I think that kind of a discourse is likely, or has a better chance of succeeding in creating the kind of society and state which I think many of us would hope that Egypt will become. So,
Samar, if I could just come back on that very point.
Sure.
I mean, equality under the law is what you're speaking of.
Without regard to religious difference. Yeah.
To religious difference, but including the right of religious actors, if we can call them that, to bring their religious views into the public square. I would presume you would agree that it is unrealistic to expect Muslims in Egypt not to bring their religion, or perhaps I'm wrong. I mean,
I think you're right.
that?
I think it definitely includes that. I don't necessarily think that that is the way to create the type of society that we want, because one of the problems is that framing it in this kind of a way, this kind of sectarian way, looking at individuals not as individuals but as members of religious groups and so on, I think that actually does, and providing rights on that basis, does more damage in some sense than good in terms of creating a kind of liberal democratic society that we want. So I would definitely include the point that you've mentioned, in addition to what I have put forward, which is in terms of equality without regard to religion. In addition to, of course, you know, the right to practice one's faith. And in the case of Egypt, I think this means dealing quite specifically with the creation of a unified building law with regard to churches and mosques and so on. However, one could possibly then differentiate that level or that reach of religious freedom with this idea of conversion, because that's the particularly sensitive issue with regard to, I have no problem with it, but many people do, right? So if there's a way, as it were, to kind of, you know, as I think Stephen Hadley said, frame it in terms of religious tolerance, right, as opposed to religious, that might have a greater likelihood of success, at least in the short term.
Which would stop short, perhaps, of a right to proselytize and a right to convert others, or in fact a right to conversion. But it's an interesting question how far a democracy can go, even a Muslim majority democracy, without grappling successfully with that at some point. Jillian.
So when I teach courses on Middle East politics, I always start the first class by saying Middle East politics is not limited to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So I want to say that the Arab Spring is not limited to Egypt. And we've been predominantly talking about Egypt, and I keep trying to talk a little bit differently. So I want to say something about Yemen. So Yemen had a couple weeks ago, Ali Abdullah Saleh formally stepped down. So Yemen is one of these extraordinary transitioning countries, and it has tremendous amount of religious diversity, and it has a large Zaydi, which is a heretic Shia sect. Ali Abdullah Saleh is from a Zaydi tribe. We don't call that state a Shia state, and we shouldn't because it's nonsensical. But in fact, he's from that that sect, and you have a very strong Wahhabi influence, Saudi-funded, Saudi-inspired, that's very contentious. You have the Ikhwanis, you have all kinds of different religious sects. And so in the case of Yemen, I think it would be a mistake to put the question of religious freedom front and center in the transition, because there's all kinds of other issues of power struggle, the leftover from the unification, which saw essentially the crushing of a largely secular South, and very progressive voices there. Not a atheist communist movement, but a very secular, you know, privatized religious communist movement. You saw a devout Muslim leader from the Yemeni Socialist Party assassinated in 2002 at a Islah convention. And one of the most contentious things that happens in the country is these Wahhabis will go into Zaydi mosques in the north and start praying in the Wahhabi style. And they're just standing there quietly, but they're doing it. It's very contentious and it's very political. And so ultimately, one would want to get to the point that a Muslim could walk into any mosque they want and pray how they would like. But I think putting those questions front and center in this kind of a transition, in Yemen's case, would be very divisive and it would exacerbate all kinds of tensions. One would hope you would get there eventually, but I think it's interesting to sort of, you know, pull that back for a second and let other kinds of questions come to the fore. I have a piece that's about to come out, actually it might be posted today, on Al Jazeera English, where I'm arguing that Yemen should probably have something like a federated state rather than a sort of unified, centralized state, specifically to address a lot of these issues. So I think when you have certain areas, like a village that has a very strong association with a particular religious sect and wants to preserve that, you know, pushing towards them that they have to be open to other voices and proselytizing in the public square is going to be very contentious and problematic. So I want to say that I don't have a particular position that it should ultimately be there or not. Ultimately, I would like to see all worldviews, you know, tolerated and accepted and open to debate. But in certain transitions, putting those issues front and center are going to be more problematic. And in other transitions, it might be a place to build bridges as a starting point. So I just want to, you know, bracket the sort of timing of that. They could play out very differently depending on context.
Good. Sam?
Does Egypt need this? I would say definitely yes, in the sense of we've had a historic problem with religion in Egypt. Religion, Islam specifically, has been viewed with high suspicion by the intelligentsia that has formed the modern Egyptian state. We've never found our peace with Islam in this sense. Many will claim that their problem is Islamism and the kind of views that it holds. But in many cases, the real problem, the root of the problem is they don't like Islam. They've never found a way to deal with the idea of this religion and how it works with the modern world. I think part of this is, which was referred to in the earlier panel, is the influence, huge influence of French secularism on Egypt. And that we, in a sense, we never read Burke, we read Voltaire and Rousseau. This is where the foundation of the Egyptian secularism comes from. So while Egypt never had an Ataturk model, it certainly was what they would have wanted if they could have achieved it. So in this sense, I think any hope of a long-term stable democracy in Egypt, along with millions of other problems that are there, will have to find a way of accommodating Islam in the public square. That people are allowed to make religious-based arguments against political decisions and economic views. This is not prohibited, it's there. It doesn't make it right or wrong, but people are allowed to do it. I think that returning to the general political situation, I agree that we are in a transition period and nothing is entirely perfect in a transition period. I don't think it's a transition to democracy, but that's another story. But in a sense, I think the policymakers are beginning to realize that this is not the beauty contest here, that we're not having the nice guys were in Tahrir, things are lovely, tech-savvy youth, and things will be great. Let's move to the next country of the Arab Spring. The realization is now coming to the city that we're in front of a situation where each country is different, where things might develop in different direction than those rosy pictures, and that we are essentially in front of the least ugly girl contest. We're choosing between not very nice options there. And none of them is entirely perfect. So I think in this sense, whether religious freedom comes at the forefront of the issues that people need to fight for or not, yes, it might not be one of those main issues at the moment.
All right, very good. We have a few on that optimistic note. Let's turn to our audience. I see we have a question over here. Mr. McFarland.
Hi, my name is Steve McFarland. Question, how long must Egypt stay in this halfway house of religious tolerance? If religious tolerance is not going to permit individuals of the minority faith to share their faith or to be perceived as even trying to persuade somebody else of the truth of their belief, or convert or proselytize, or say something derogatory that would be, at least by accusation, blasphemic. If that is a bridge too far for religious freedom in our lifetime, is that much of a halfway house to live in long term? Because I believe that the ability to share one's faith and to disagree with a majority faith and to try to persuade someone of the truth of your beliefs is the essence of religious freedom. And religious tolerance sounds more like I tolerate what other people's dogs do on my lawn. You know, I just put up with it.
You shouldn't do that, Steve.
I know, but you know that's not my notion of religious freedom. So, comment?
Summer, would you like to
No.
take that?
I don't
But
think.
you will.
I don't think. Yes, I think that if, and maybe I'm wrong. Correct me, but I think if you look at where Egypt is right now, where it's been, what the current state of things are, we will be fortunate to achieve religious tolerance and achieve equality before the law, regardless of one's faith. The struggle, right now, nor should it necessarily be, for example, regarding Article 2 of the Egyptian Constitution. Islam is the religion of state, Arabic is its language, and the principles of the Sharia are the primary source of legislation, exactly formulated as such, is about, and the most liberal and realistic goal one can have is to preserve the article as is. Because, and I myself, and Mr. Mohammed al-Baradei also is in favor of keeping the article as is, whereas the Salafis, for example, want to change the article to increase the importance of Islam and the Sharia by either getting rid of the principles, because the principles of the Sharia are things that all of us can agree with, the social justice, equality, truth, and so on, to either the Sharia or ahkam al-Sharia, the rulings of the Sharia, so that you can have more specific rulings be the basis of law as opposed to these wonderful principles. So I think if we achieve religious tolerance, right now, and probably for some time to come, meaning equality before the law for all, the right to practice one's faith, and so on, that will be a significant achievement.
Okay, I hear you. I would like to point out on Steve's behalf, I think he would say that the standard that you set of equality before the law is not met if one cannot share one's religious beliefs publicly. So I think we just have a disagreement over what equality before the law means and what religious freedom may mean. And the question I asked was intended to get to the utilitarian.
The problem
can
is
it work?
If you do this, the ability to share one's faith, and if that means proselytizing, right, then you are in an arms race.
No, it doesn't mean proselytizing. That's a bad word.
I'm sorry,
it means
I don't know.
sharing your faith and trying to convince others that you're right.
Okay, I don't know what the difference is,
there isn't any. I'm just kidding you.
Okay. So
proselytism though has a negative term.
Okay.
To
you then have. I don't know if you agree with me. Then you have an arms race essentially. And that is an arms race that is bad for religious minorities, probably, right? And it's also not the kind of race that Egypt should be engaged in right now. At least that's what I...
So the question is, and please, you needn't answer this. The question that I was posing is, given that reality, I agree with you, is democracy over the long term possible until this issue is resolved, or at least grappled with honestly? And I agree that it isn't.
Yeah. Just very briefly, I don't think that, it is something that, radically or fundamentally impedes the ability of a liberal democracy being established in Egypt. It might not be the extent that you'd like, but I think...
Okay, fair enough. Jillian?
Yeah, I echo. I pretty much echo your point. I mean, I think it should be there, but I don't think it needs to be there front and center. And I think when there's other kinds of security and confidence that comes from the institutions, when the institutions are functioning in a way that people feel safe, then I think there would emerge, more freedom of expression around particular kinds of issues, where people don't have to feel that one statement is, just a complete threat to their whole community. They don't have to feel panicky. But I think that will be gradual, and I think you can get there in some ways through the exercise and functioning of that space.
Sam.
Let me begin by comment by the story that happened yesterday in Egypt. Maybe a month ago, there was a school teacher in Asyut in the south of Egypt who, during the class break, was sitting in the teacher's lounge, and he's Christian, and a conversation begins between a Salafi teacher and himself that results in a religious discussion. And the Salafi teacher claims, there's no proof of that the Christian insulted the Prophet. This automatically results in rioting in the area, which results, of course, in that teacher being arrested. The court system, which is hugely dysfunctional, suddenly becomes very functional. After 1 day of hearing the case, the whole case takes 3 days, 1 day of hearing it, without anything, they give him a couple of years of a sentence. The Salafis don't like that fact because they think that a couple of years is not enough. So they demonstrate in front of the court and want a death sentence. This is the good punishment for such an act. Now, what happens actually yesterday is due to human rights organizations' pressure and so on, the case goes into another hearing, an appeal of that case. And the guy can't get a lawyer. Not because he doesn't have people willing to represent him, but because there are 300 other lawyers that prohibit any lawyer representing him from entering the courtroom. That's a problem. No, you will not have democracy unless you deal with such an issue. The issue is not, you cannot escape it within the question of equality. Not the fact that can he preach Christianity to others or not, but can he get a fair trial for this crime if we even consider it a crime? Can he get a lawyer to defend him in that case or not? So I think it is an integral part of the story of a democratic transition. Will you get it? I doubt. Should you work on it exclusively? No. Is it part of a larger picture that not everything of it will be perfect, not today or tomorrow or in even 10 or 20 years? That's the sad story of a long process of a transition.
Okay, let's get another question. How about right here?
Thank you. My name is Hara Hashmi from the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. And my question, touching upon what you mentioned about Article 2 of Egypt's constitution, is just about more of the constitutional development in these countries and the role that religion will play. So taking into context just the various types of, constitutional recognition of religion, Turkey being a model which is, declares in its constitution that it's secular, or Pakistan, which declares that Islam is the religion of Pakistan, or something like Indonesia, which in its 1945 constitution says that, well, Indonesia is based on recognizing that the country, that there is one God, there is also a provision for religious liberty that recognizes that people have the right to practice their religion. So in the context of these Arab Spring countries, specifically Tunisia, I'm interested in knowing what you think will be the future of whether they will recognize Islam outright as the religion of the state, and how you think this will reflect on religious liberties and the protection of minority religions.
I can comment briefly. I mean, I'm not an expert on Tunisia, but I spent some weeks there this spring in January for the anniversary. And one of the things that struck me is, with Nahda having won, such a large 40% of the assembly. So I was in a mountaintop town called Le Kef on the anniversary of the revolution, which was one of the places where there were a lot of protests weeks before it ever got to the capital, a year ago. And so they were defending the grocery stores that had burnt down last year. They're making sure that they don't get burnt down again. And there's piles of tires burning here and there, and people are protesting. Nothing has changed after a year. But the most interesting thing is one of the most heavily guarded buildings in town was the Nahda office, because Nahda in power is now panicky that they're the target of things haven't really changed. Another incident, and then I'll try to weave it together. Another incident was that there are women showing up for exams in the universities wearing niqab, like 3 at a time, and you're not allowed to take an exam according to the current rules because you have to show your face. And so there was intended to be very provocative. The time I was there, the Salafi group also established a caliphate outside of Tunis for a short period of time. I tried to go, my friends would not take me. So there's these pushing going on, and there's tensions between Nahda and the Salafis. But one of the really interesting things was that Nahda kept saying, the Nahda people we talked to, they kept saying that they opposed this, they were completely against this, this isn't what they represented. They wanted, to maintain it as a secular state. But the Nahda minister of higher education refused to make a statement against, against the sort of Salafi inroads and these pushing, refused to take a stand on that. And that was seen as very, very troubling by secularists in the country, that, you're saying one thing, but is this really down the road, you're going to remain silent. It's something that came up in an earlier session, but sometimes on the Coptic issue, sometimes the lack of doing something speaks incredibly loud. The Mubarak regime's lack of intervention around all kinds of issues, attacks on university professors, attacks on Copts, their silence around those issues speaks volumes. And so I think in Tunisia, there's this moment of everyone is holding their breath. And while Nahda says it's not going to push that forward, there are threads of nervousness for some people that might be coming down the road a year or two from now. Again, I'm not an expert on Tunisia, but this, from my recent trip there, I thought that was a really interesting point of tension. And people are nervous about it.
Anybody? Okay. I think we had a question back here. We have time, unfortunately, for only one more. So, okay, this gentleman here. Here we go, up here. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Richard Hyde. I direct the Religion Consulting Group. I'm curious about other bases of identity in the countries that you're talking about. They all speak Arabic. They're mostly Muslim, but what differentiates a Tunisian from a Moroccan, from an Algerian, from an Egyptian, et cetera? There must be lots of other things going on here.
Well, I mean, you know, there are unlimited, you know, differences. I mean, these are overlapping identities. I mean, you know, the Arabic that the Tunisian speaks is not the Arabic that I speak, nor is the French in the Arabic that the Tunisian speaks the French that I, you know, the little French that I know. You know, so there are differences in history. There are differences in colonial history and colonial influence. There are differences, the kind of historical sediment of, for example, the Bourguiba regime and the attempted secularism in law even in Tunisia is something, for a quite long period of time, is something that's quite different than what was experienced in Egypt, for example. So there are, you know, there are similarities, but there are differences. These are multiple overlapping identities, as identities always are. I don't know what else to say about that.
I would add, and sort of, besides, you know, comparison from country to country, of course, I mean, to me, the biggest difference between countries is cuisine. But within countries, I mean, I think there's a lot of tension. So in Syria, you know, the ruling regime is Alawi, and the majority is excluded. In Bahrain, the ruling regime is Sunni, and the majority Shia are excluded. And so I think that some of the internal tensions and identities, even ones that are about religion, sometimes aren't about the content of those religious differences so much as about historical sectarian differences of who had power, who's excluded, who's been effective trading. And I think those tensions underlie things in long-standing ways that then can be, you know, exposed and expressed in terms of religious differences. But sometimes they're about religious differences that sometimes aren't about religious differences at all. They're about other issues that map on to those different identities. And I think paying attention to that's crucial, because sometimes there are, like the Wahhabis going into the Zaydi mosques, that's about a religious difference. It's very specific. It's also political. But, you know, the Alawis and the rest of Syria, that's about power and repression.
Sam?
I think they've said it all.
All right. Well, this brings this panel to a close. I'm delighted that we had a little bit of controversy. I was worried that we were all going to agree on everything, and that's never happened before in our religious freedom conferences. So please join me in thanking our guests.